public is fascinated by true crime stories, and they turn murderers into celebrities.
But it's one thing to watch it on TV. It's a completely another deal to actually deal with those chilling figures in person. Buffalo native Jeffrey Smalldon made a career of consulting on close to 300 death penalty cases. His new book, That Beast Was Not Me, touches on those 5 decades, studying some of the most infamous figures of our time. Doctor, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you for having me. Very nice to be here.
This is an interesting line of work. How did you manage to work your way into this?
Well, that's a long story that I don't have time to tell, but I thought I was going to be an English professor. And when I decided I wasn't going to do that after a number of years of graduate study, I decided maybe I'd be a hospital administrator. And while I was at a hospital in Columbus, Ohio, 2 of my coworkers were murdered on a Friday afternoon right off the main hallway of the hospital. And when that happened, it seemed like 2 entirely distinct chapters in my life were joined, because a decade before that, at the suggestion of my abnormal psychology professor when I was still an undergrad, I began corresponding with Charles Manson and other members of the Manson family, and had a bunch of my letters discovered in Squeaky Frommy's apartment after her attempt to assassinate President Gerald Ford in 1975. So when these hospital murders occurred in 1983, it seemed as though murder was sort of following me as a theme in my life. And at that point, I decided to go back and do my PhD and become a forensic psychologist.
Is it true that this all started for you as a child?
Well, I wouldn't say necessarily my interest in serial murder, but my interest in crime and criminology. My dad was a Hoover-era G-man. That's what I grew up with. I've always said I grew up with a soft hum of talk about crime and criminality at home, and my dad would come home with his shoulder holster and gun on at lunch. I knew that that was something the fathers of most of my friends didn't do. So I was interested in crime from a very early age.
How do you handle this line of work? Because obviously the people that you're meeting are people who have done some terrible things, but they are people. It's like the juxtaposition of being a normal person versus being a serial killer. How did you navigate that through your line of work and through your writings?
Well, one of the things, when I actually became a forensic psychologist and I was evaluating violent criminals and in death penalty cases, often having to testify at the sentencing hearings of those cases, I always worked from a core belief that if I tried hard enough, I could find in the backgrounds of these badly damaged people evidence of the circumstances that had put them on a pathway to become the sort of person who could have committed the horrible crimes that they committed. So I always tried to approach them with an attitude of, it wasn't like I was trying to befriend them or convince them that I thought they were good people, but I also didn't approach them with a judgmental attitude, because if you do that as a forensic psychologist, you can never build rapport and never get anywhere toward your goal of finding out what it was in their lives that happened that caused them to become the adults they became.
Have you ever had any cases that came really close where it became personal for you?
Yeah, I did. I think for the most part, I became a pretty skilled compartmentalizer. You have to be, or you couldn't do the kind of work that I did. But I remember one case in particular toward the end of my career, and it seems kind of strange because I had worked on a lot of horrible cases with horrible facts, multiple victims, and so on. But this particular case was the case of a father who had gone through a very nasty divorce. And to make a long story short, after a night spent in his car with the 2 children strapped in their car seats in the back of his car and talking to his ex-wife saying, "You have to come and talk with me," and her saying, "No, you just enjoy your time with the children. We don't have anything to say to one another." And he said, "No, you don't understand." And he ended up killing both of the children in their car seats. That one affected me in a way I don't know that any other case I worked on ever did.
In your studies and what you found, is anyone capable of doing this, or is there a common thread line that you've linked between the people that you've met over your career?
Well, there are certainly many commonalities among the violent criminals that I've worked in. I wouldn't say anyone could do these things. At least under most circumstances, most people couldn't do them. And maybe people would fantasize about doing them, but they would manage those fantasies and those impulses and never act out on them. I did, on the other hand, often wonder, had I been born to different parents under different circumstances, not had the opportunities I had, fallen in with a bad crowd early in my life, could I have traveled a pathway where committing a violent crime like some of these people committed might have been a possible outcome for me? And I think my answer to that is yes, that could have happened. And I mean, history is replete with examples of people who seem like otherwise normal people, but committed atrocities under a certain set of circumstances.
For sure.
Yes. Well, we appreciate your time. It certainly is interesting work. The book is called That Beast Was Not Me by Jeffrey Smalldon. It's available starting through this week through Black Lion Publishing and Amazon.